Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Yonatan Fessha. I'm a professor of law at the University of the Western Cape and currently the UWC Research Chair on Constitutional Design for Divided Societies. So I would like to welcome all of you to our webinar/seminar series, Conversations on Constitutional Design. This is where we meet to discuss the relevance and effectiveness of constitutional design in dealing with the challenges of divided society. So we invite scholars that analyze the different options as well as the challenges that constitution makers face when designing a constitution in a context of a very deeply polarized society. And today we are joined by Dr. Paul Anderson, who is a senior lecturer in politics at Liverpool John Moores University. His research largely focuses on minority and majority nationalism, autonomy and secessionist movements, intergovernmental relations, as well as federalism and conflict resolution. Paul has published widely on these topics, with articles featuring in major journals, including the Journal of European Public Policy, Nations and Nationalism, Parliamentary Studies, and the Journal of Regional and Federal Studies. But more importantly, Paul is the author of a new book, which is the focus of today's conversation. The title of his book is Territorial Politics in Catalonia and Scotland, Nations in Flux, published by Manchester University Press in 2024. The book explores the evolution of territorial politics in Catalonia and Scotland since 2010 and raises very important questions about the accommodation of diversity in divided societies. So congratulations, Paul, on this important contribution to the study of divided societies. And thanks for agreeing to take us through your major findings and arguments of your book. Paul has 40 minutes to make the presentation, and that will be followed by 20 minutes of questions and comments. You can use the chat box for questions and for comments. So with these words, it's my great pleasure to hand over to Paul. So Paul, the virtual floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Yonatan. Good afternoon, everybody, and particularly thank you very much to Yonatan for inviting me along to discuss this new book, but for me, an old book, because as all academics will agree, this is a book that has been in my mind for a long time and took some time to come to fruition as well. But I'm very happy to be here today to discuss the topic of the book and to discuss two important cases when it comes to debates on minority nationalism and independence, but probably also two of the most well-known cases, not just here in Western Europe, but probably worldwide, dominating headlines at certain points over the last 10 years for good, but also for bad as well. So I'm very happy to be here today to discuss the book, and just picking up on some of the things that Yonatan said there about the study of deeply polarized and divided societies. Scotland and Catalonia are certainly diverse societies, but there is a debate up there whether or not these would qualify necessarily as deeply divided or hugely polarized societies. But there is, of course, within both cases, significant polarization, as unfortunately there is across the world now in countries all over, from those emerging democracies to the deeply seated democracies. There is polarization in both of these cases around the topic of union and the topic of independence, and that is the feature of this book. The book comes from my doctoral studies and sort of postdoctorate studies as well, but its roots go back all the way to my undergraduate degree. So I studied politics and Spanish at university, and as part of that degree, I got to spend a year in Spain to learn Spanish, and I was sent to Catalonia for a year. where naively I knew nothing about the place. So I arrived there to teach English, and all of a sudden I was working in a school where no one spoke Spanish. They were all speaking in Catalan. And there was this connection that many Catalans felt between myself as someone from Scotland and them as Catalonia, as Catalan. And again, this was something that I couldn't quite understand. People would call me brother, which I thought was just a term of affection. But eventually it came that these people within Catalonia felt that there was a connection between Catalonia and Scotland that I, until that point, had not considered. And so when I went back to university, I kind of decided to learn more about the politics of Catalonia, to compare that with Scotland. And when I finished my undergraduate degree, I graduated on the Tuesday, failed my driving test on the Wednesday, and bought a one-way ticket to Catalonia on the Thursday. And off I went there to teach English for a year, but also to kind of learn Catalan and to learn more about the culture. And I ended up staying there for 5 years maybe. I did my master's there, specializing in the topic of constitutional design, federalism, nationalism, etc. And then went on to do my PhD. And this book, therefore, is the fruit of all of those years of kind of making those connections between the two cases. And the book, in essence, as I sort of lay out in the introduction, is a book of 3 parts. Really thinking about it is probably a book of 4 parts, with the introduction, conclusion, and epilogue bookending both of those, or bookending the book. But it's a book of 3 parts in terms of it kicks off with some theory and context around how we accommodate diversity within plurinational states, and focusing on that plurinationalism is important because in the case of the UK, plurinationalism is a sort of accepted fact of the cases, but in Spain is a bit more contested, and there's a bit more polarization around recognition of the state and of specifically Catalonia. And then moving on from that, sort of setting the scene for the empirical analysis, drawing on some of the historical context of both the cases. And it's a book that compares 2 cases, Scotland and Catalonia, but arguably you could argue that it also compares 2 other cases, that of Spain and that of the UK. Because in order to understand these minority nations within and how they have evolved and function, it's also important to understand the wider political context in which they are operating in, because this wider context, of course, contextualizes how territorial politics has evolved. The book then moves on to 2 standalone chapters that looks at both of the cases in detail. So it's a small n study, drawing upon interviews that I did with politicians and civil society activists in both countries. And then the book finishes with a chapter drawing out some comparative conclusions and looking at the similarities and differences from both cases, but also what can we learn from these cases about them specifically, but also how we study constitutional design and multinationalism, federalism, territorial politics in general. So the book focuses on these 2 cases that I've mentioned, Scotland and Catalonia, and they are, I think it's fair to say, the 2 of the most well-known cases of minority nationalism, if not the 2 most known cases of minority nationalism, and specifically pro-independence nationalism. So I think this obviously lends itself to a very interesting and fruitful comparison, in that both cases already share similarities, but they also have differences as well, and this is what makes the comparison interesting. So we have these 2 very important cases, and what kind of drove me to focus specifically on 2010 onwards is this has been a period in both cases of tumultuous change, that we've seen in both cases transformational events that have been triggered by electoral politics in some instances, or by wider issues, crises, for example, in others, that have led to such transformational change that what went before the cases is, of course, still exists and is still important, but actually we see quite significant evolution of these movements in over that period. So I focused on a specific 10-year period, this is a good thing as an academic in terms of being able to control the comparison. But of course, most of this now becomes contemporary history rather than contemporary politics, but there's still something meaningful there to look at. And what I've done is focus specifically on two kind of wide areas, institutional structures and the key actors involved. And in order to do that, I decided to focus on 5 specific themes within the cases. One, for practical reasons, to look at everything, I would have to probably write 4 or 5 books in order to try and uncover everything that has gone on in just this 10-year period. But also, by focusing on these 5 things, it's enabled me to have this controlled comparison in order to look at the same things in both cases. So I look at themes such as recognition and self-rule, shared rule, specifically focused on intergovernmental relations. I look at the role of litigation and constitutional litigation and the role of the courts. And then moving on to sort of look specifically at the actors, I look at the pro-union movements, so the state nationalist movements, and then specifically the independence movements. And the principal objective of the book is to compare, to explore how territorial politics has evolved over this period and compare both cases. And then the secondary objective of the book is to say, well, okay, having assessed the territorial models in both cases, how could these models be further reformed, if necessary, in order to ensure that we have more accommodative territorial models? And this secondary objective comes primarily from the theoretical prism through which I look at the cases. I'm not going to labour through these different theories here. More than happy to discuss them, and I'm sure you're aware of several of them anyway. But the book sort of begins with a big question. How do you accommodate diversity peacefully within a democratic plurinational state? Now, this is not a highly original question. There are hundreds of books and journal articles that have sought to explore this question. But the book starts off with this large question and then tailors this specifically to the Catalan and Scottish cases. And I draw upon 3 principal theories in order to examine how accommodation becomes an important tool within the design of divided and diverse societies. So I start off with this kind of broad theory of liberal nationalism, much associated with the Canadian case, developed and advanced by many Canadian scholars, that sort of seeks to prove that nationalism, in effect, is not necessarily a bad thing, and that nationalism and democracy don't need to be antagonistic phenomena, that actually both of these phenomena can exist. And it's important that we recognize it can exist, because for some people, their sense of national identity is hugely important, and therefore we should seek to accommodate that. And so here for liberal nationalists, the focus is on about recognition of the importance of national identity, of culture, and the process of self-determination. It's about focusing on respecting diversity and difference. And in order to achieve this, there's a consensus amongst liberal national scholars that there needs to be some form of self-government in order to ensure that minorities can promote and protect their sense of self and sense of difference, as well as ensure that this can flourish within the state. What is interesting in the debate of liberal nationalists is there's no consensus necessarily on the topic of secession or independence. So there's no right to secession necessarily, unless it's justified within certain circumstances. But what there is consensus is that secession need not be a taboo subject, that if there is a process of secession and processes of secessionism, then these should be dealt with peacefully and democratically in order to ensure an outcome. Multinational federalism basically builds on liberal nationalism, and I think within the book I consider multinational federalism to be a sort of institutional blueprint for what liberal nationalist scholars were thinking about. And I use this quote from Gagnon and Tremblay about the importance of building diversity cognizant institutional frameworks. That is, that we're building frameworks, institutional frameworks. Constitutional design is recognizing this diversity where it exists within these plurinational states and seeks to advance that. And so here what we find is we have similar processes.
Sorry, Paul. Sorry for interrupting. The slides, we only see only one slide so far. Is that the case?
Yeah, no, that's fine. Is it still a theoretical framework?
No, it's still only the first slide. The first page, yeah.
Oh, sorry, I've been moving through them.
Okay, yeah, so just...
let me, wait a minute, I may have discovered the problem. Has it changed now?
Now, yes, yeah.
Okay, I'm changing it on one screen, but not on the other. So apologies, you've missed all my fantastic slides so far, but I will happily share them so that you can see them. So this is the book in general, and then the sort of focus of the cases. And here now is this theoretical framework that I'm discussing. So here the focus of this theoretical framework, as I've been saying, is about this accommodation. So we have liberal nationalism, and then we have multinational federalism, and within this framework of multinational federalism, we're very much focusing on institutions. So it's about recognition, constitutional recognition. It's about the importance of institutional processes and asymmetry. And this is something that, as you'll see as we get into the Spanish case, becomes a bit more problematic. But it's recognition that asymmetry and asymmetrical designs within multinational federal states are important in order to ensure accommodation for certain groups within it. And there's a focus here, therefore, on federal design, from self-rule through to shared rule, as well as this elusive idea of a federal political culture. So this idea that institutions matter, but so too does the culture within federalism in order for this to function. So here, what is interesting is that neither Spain nor the UK, in my opinion, I'll qualify this, are functioning federations. They have federal elements for sure, but they are not federations per se. But what they do have is some federal features. And so therefore, this is how we can apply this kind of idea of multinational federalism to it. In a similar vein to liberal nationalism, there is little consensus amongst multinational federal scholars about secession. So there's no, for example, guaranteed right to secession, but there is this similar idea that we should not be trying to quit or get rid of these conversations without dealing with them in a democratic and peaceful way. And then the final thing to tie the theoretical framework together is drawing a bit on theories of power sharing. Now, again, not hugely relevant at the moment in terms of both of these cases, but what I kind of argue in the book is we can learn a lot from power sharing theories, both institutionally, but also from this idea of the behavior, the accommodative behavior behind power sharing theories. So specifically focusing on consociationalism here, it's recognizing that accommodation is important, but also that we need to temper majoritarianism within plurinational states. That is, that within plurinational states, it's important that majority groups recognize that they are in a more privileged position because they are the majority, but in certain circumstances, they ought not to act like the majority. That is, that there needs to be processes of compromise within these ideas. So the idea here is around focusing on non-hierarchical relationships within the debate on autonomy and territorial politics. So if we move on then to the sort of historical context that I set up within the book, here I'm basically providing a lot of detail of the two cases so that I can sort of move on and focus on this 10-year period within both Scotland and Catalonia. So what I do in this section is focus on three main themes that then tie up the five sort of specific themes that I focus on within the empirical chapters. And what's interesting here is I'm comparing the 4 cases. So I'm comparing Scotland and Catalonia, but I'm specifically also looking at Spain and the UK to sort of understand how Scotland and Catalonia have evolved territorially and politically through the context of the 2 cases. So what I'm sort of teasing out here is the strong conceptions of identity within Scotland and Catalonia at these times, and the kind of evolution of nationalist movements, moving from focused on cultural issues to becoming politically nationalist movements. But the key thing here is that both of these movements, for much of their historical time, have been focused on autonomy and not secession. So as I sort of go on to discuss later in this chapter, the focus on independence is relatively recent. It's a relatively recent phenomenon. But historically, both of these cases, the nationalist movements in Scotland and Catalonia, have evolved to support autonomy under different names, but within the parameters of the British and the Spanish cases. What's also interesting, if you look at how Spanish and British nationalism evolved over this time, one of the things I discovered when I was comparing them in this chapter is that both British and Spanish identities have been forged using the same elements. Elements of empire, elements of war, and elements of religion. So in using sort of these traits, what the Spanish and British nationalism have been able to do is to kind of create a sense of patriotism, because we are British and we have an empire, so this unites everyone within that territory. The same within Spain, or religion, using that as a tool of kind of emboldening the similarities between people across the country, even though they may speak different languages or have different cultural traits. But what is also interesting here is that the British identity seems to become much more, or is much more inclusive than the Spanish identity. That is, in order to be British, you must also be Scottish or English or Welsh or Irish. Whereas the Spanish identity hasn't been forged in that same inclusive notion, whereas often, particularly during periods of dictatorship, which we didn't have in the UK, you have a choice between being Catalan or being Spanish, that these two were not seen as mutually exclusive. What we have also in terms of the processes of autonomy is different processes of how the states of Spain and the UK came into being through processes of coercion and colonization, or processes of consent. Again, here we see big historical differences in the sense that when Scotland voluntarily joined the Union to form part of the United Kingdom, it had elements where it was accommodated. So Scottish law continues to this day, where there's a different legal system in both in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. Scottish education was different. You have, for example, still today the Church of Scotland, and then you have the Church of England. So these traits were allowed to continue, whereas in Catalonia you have a process more of assimilation, where the idea was to root out and get rid of this sense of Catalan. And then finally, in the kind of debates on secession, the key thing here to emphasize is how recent the debates on independence are. We know Scotland and Catalonia today as the two most active independence movements in Western Europe, where over the last 10 years they've dominated debate and discussion in this topic. But secession and support for independence is relatively recent, going back to the early 20th century. So it's not something that's existed from the moment Scottish nationalism and Catalan nationalism existed long before debates on independence evolved. And here also it's important to recognise the contextual differences between the fact that the UK doesn't have a codified constitution, and yet in Spain you have not only a codified and written constitution, but quite a rigid constitution as well. The other difference to tease up here is the differences in the state. So as we kind of move on to compare the two cases, I just wanted to throw up the maps here of both cases. In the Spain is composed of autonomous communities. It has 17 autonomous communities, and these were fruit of the constitution that was promulgated in 1978 after the fall of the dictatorship and the death of Franco. None of these autonomous communities are named in the constitution because many of them didn't exist before the constitution was created, but some, like the Basque Country, like Catalonia, like Galicia, did exist before, and therefore were entitled to different processes of territorial reform in the constitution. The United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, to give the state its full name, is made up of 4 territories. And what's interesting here is we have, like Spain, an asymmetrical design of the state, where Scotland, Northern Ireland, and Wales have their own parliaments and have their own governments. But England, the largest part of the territory, where 85% of the population live, there is no form of devolution, of political or legislative devolution like exists in Scotland or Wales. That's changing now, and this is a project that I'm working on at the moment, but there is no English government, there is no English parliament. So those are the sort of 2 states that are in the background of Scotland and Catalonia. And then you have these 2 hugely interesting, I'm biased, of course, but hugely interesting cases that illuminate some of the challenges and opportunities of constitutional design in diverse places. So what I do in the book, as I laid out earlier, is focus on 5 specific areas or themes related to the study of territorial politics. So what I'll do now is sort of talk you through some of the comparisons between both of those cases, and then, you know, happy to answer any questions at the end about what I cannot cover. So the book took a few years to write, but compacting that into 40 minutes is, of course, a huge challenge. So the first thing to pick up on is the debate around recognition and self-rule. So these are considered by liberal nationalists, by multinational federalists, and by consociationalists to be integral components within constitutional design. That if you have a deeply diverse or deeply divided society, then often what sort of specific groups within these societies will want is some form of recognition or some form of self-rule. And this is the same within the case of Catalonia and the case of Scotland, where you have claims throughout history for different elements of constitutional or legal recognition or some form of self-government. What you have in both cases, however, when it comes to recognition, is quite big differences. In the case of the UK, it is not controversial whatsoever to refer to the United Kingdom as a plurinational or multinational state, to say that it's a state composed of 4 nations, of 4 countries. There is some controversy around Northern Ireland, but we don't need to get into that today. But recognition of Scotland as a nation is not controversial at all. And in fact, there is no constitutional recognition of Scotland as a nation, but there's no need for it because it's so common and so part of the political culture that there's never been any need for constitutional or legal recognition, like you find, for example, in Quebec or indeed in other cases. Reference to Catalonia as a nation, as you can see here in this image, is, however, hugely controversial within Spain. So for many Catalans, Catalonia is a nation and they feel that it is their nation, but this is uncomfortable territory for many Spaniards and for Spanish political elites. And as a result of that, there is no constitutional or legal recognition that Catalonia is a nation. And in fact, Article 2 of the Spanish Constitution makes very clear that Spain has only one nation, and that is the nation of Spain. So what we find here is contrast in the understanding of the wider states as plurinational states, whereas for in the UK, this is an accepted fact that is not necessarily something that is celebrated, but it's an accepted fact. Whereas in Spain, it's a bit more controversial, where you have political parties on the left or centre left that tend to acknowledge this idea of Spain as a nation of nations or a country of countries. But you have political parties on the right who are very uncomfortable with this, and they recognise Spain as a mononational state only. The other interesting comparison to tease out here is the processes of asymmetry. So both Spain and the UK are asymmetrical territorial systems. You have different powers, for example, in the UK, devolved to the different parliaments. The same in Spain, where you have, for example, the Basque Country and Navarra have certain or have fiscal autonomy that's not rolled out across the rest of Spain. But in the UK, whilst asymmetry is seen as a fact, a necessary fact, often given in recognition of the fact that Scotland was an independent nation of the past and that support for self-government was stronger. In Spain, asymmetry is seen by some across both the left and the right as a potential threat, that it's a system that introduces inequality into the system, and therefore is something that should be made symmetrical. And you have throughout, since the transition to democracy in the 1970s, processes of symmetricization in Spain, where the big political parties have tried to ensure that all autonomous communities have the same powers, so that not one is not treated differently than the other. And then if you move on to the debate on autonomy, the sort of first thing to say is that both Catalonia and Scotland are hugely powerful sub-state nations. If you compare them to some units within federal systems, they have more or the same political power as some federations. So it's not that they are weak entities or political entities, but what they don't have that you would have, for example, in a federation, is constitutional protection in order to exercise the powers that have been devolved to them. So what you have in both cases throughout the period that I'm looking at is a process of creeping centralization. Now, this has always really existed in Spain, where the Spanish government has at times used what are called organic laws, which impose certain regulations and rules and guidelines on autonomous communities. But what you also have in Catalonia is very limited exclusive powers. That is that most powers are shared, are concurrent with the central government, and that leads to kind of an inability in order to enact policies that you want. In the UK, Scotland has a lot of exclusive powers. Concurrent powers are actually a relatively recent feature of the system. So they do have exclusive powers, but what you have in the UK is a principle of parliamentary sovereignty. That is that the UK Parliament is the only sovereign parliament, and so therefore, if the UK Parliament wants to do something, it can. It has the ability to do this. Now, there is a convention in the UK called the Sewell Convention that's there to temper this, and the Sewell Convention goes along the lines of, if the UK Parliament wants to enact something in a devolved area, it will only do so, or it will not normally do so, without the permission of the devolved parliaments. But if the devolved parliament says no, the UK Parliament can still go ahead. And from, I just looked before I came on here, between 2019 and 2024, so outside the scope of this book, 13 times the Scottish Parliament has said no to the UK Parliament intervening in legislation, and the UK Parliament has proceeded to do so. So there's very little constitutional protection for both of these nations in terms of self-government. In terms of shared rule, which is an important part of constitutional design, because shared rule is often the glue that holds the systems together. It provides opportunities of influence for sub-state regions and national governments to influence or at least have their voice heard in national debates. But in the UK, Spain in general, these are generally weak. And this is not surprising, because when you have minority movements campaigning for self-government, their focus is on how much can we get for ourselves, not how do we make the state as a whole work. But in both cases, you have processes of intergovernmental relations, but these have been largely weak. And in both cases, they're relying on goodwill, and they're very much, particularly in Spain, coloured by party political dynamics. So in the UK and Spain, these intergovernmental forums tend not to meet very often. And when they do meet, or when they did meet during the 10-year period that I was looking at, the dynamics within them were not constructive dynamics built up on, we need to work together and a sense of trust and partnership and mutual respect. these dynamics were very much coloured by suspicion, by mistrust, and by an unwillingness on both sides to see a way forward. Now, what's interesting is this changed with the COVID pandemic, as is the case all around the world in federal systems, where we saw intergovernmental relations, in some cases, becoming much more important, and in other cases being put to the side. But what you have in both cases, in Spain and the UK, focused on Catalonia and Scotland, is you have unprecedented intergovernmental interaction in both of these cases, and lessons have been learned from this process to sort of move on. But you have, in general, weak intergovernmental relations that don't tend, or that haven't tended to work, albeit that process and learning from COVID has changed that as we move on. I'm aware of time, so I won't dwell too much on that. But one of the interesting, or I think the most interesting comparison in the book comes from looking at the role of the constitutional courts. So the kind of important thing to flag up here when we're talking about the constitutional courts is they're very different. So the first thing is the UK doesn't have a constitutional court. It has a Supreme Court, and that Supreme Court was only created after the millennium, so legislation in 2005 and then in 2009. So you have very different courts in both systems, but also very different approaches in that the Spanish Constitutional Court has been responsible for setting the parameters of the territorial models throughout Spain's autonomous communities. They've actively shaped the evolution of territorial politics, whereas in the UK, most decisions have been left to the political realm, not the legal realm. And so in the UK, we've never had legal showdowns in the courts until the process of Brexit. And Brexit sort of changed everything here, where we started to see significant polarization between the different governments within both of these cases. And I think what's also interesting here is to look at this plurinational recognition. So as you can see, hopefully on screen, you have the symbol of the UK Supreme Court. You have the four nations represented in the symbol because you have the four flowers of the different nations of the UK Supreme Court. And this is consciously done by the UK Supreme Court to say that we are, and it is, the only court for the whole of the UK. You don't have that necessarily or you don't have that at all, for example, in the Spanish Supreme Court or Constitutional Court, sorry, where there's no, for example, in the UK Supreme Court, you will have a Scottish judge, you will have a Northern Irish judge, and more recently, you'll have a Welsh judge, as well as English justices. You don't have this in the case, for example, of Spain. But what's also interesting here is how the debate on independence has been managed. In Spain, the debate on independence has very much been managed by the courts. And this is because the Spanish government at the time pushed this towards the courts and said, this is a legal issue, not a political issue. Whereas in the case of the UK, the independence referendum that Scotland had in 2014 was very much seen as a political issue and not a legal issue. This, however, has changed somewhat in the UK post-Brexit, where we've seen more challenges going to court as trust has broken down between the Scottish and UK governments. Then there's this willingness more to use the courts in order to intervene. But there's a huge contrast here between how the Spanish government used the courts in order to stop or try to stop independence within Catalonia, and then in the UK where this was not the case. If we move on to the kind of fourth element around state nationalism, then this is a kind of the common thread between all state nationalist movements within both cases is a commitment to the unity of either the UK or to Spain. But of course, what we have here is we have groups largely on the left, centre left, and groups largely on the right, centre right, and also in the case of Spain, the extreme right. And only in the case of Spain do we have the extreme right, so Vox, campaigning to get rid of all form, to abolish the territorial model across Spain. So you don't have that at all in the UK. There's no political party or political movement wanting to abolish devolution or anything like this, but you do have that in Spain. What's interesting here, if we compare both cases, is if you look at political parties on the left, you tend to have a more pro-decentralization, pro-federal discourse. That's debatable to a certain extent, but certainly this is what you see. On the right, you have kind of a more a sort of appetite more for centralization, and far right then for a unitary system. So what we see in both cases over this 10-year period, as the state unity has come under attack from nationalists within Catalonia and Scotland, you see very assertive state nationalism on the part of the British and Spanish government. And as I argue in the book, and I think this is a sort of key thing for you to dwell on, this assertive unionism is, as far as I'm concerned, as much a threat to the continuation of the British and Spanish states as independence movements. That is, that you have this very muscular unionism that seeks to put minority nations in their place, and this is a cause for concern when it comes to democratic frameworks. And then the final thing that I kind of pick up on in the book, it relates to the independence movements. And again, here you have very interesting similarities and differences between both cases. The most interesting similarity is how support for independence moved from the political margins to the political mainstream. So if I show you the two graphs that I tease out in the book, you will see very clearly in the case of Catalonia, so independence is the line with the X, how in 2010, when I kind of started the research in this book, it's under 20%, and then it kind of rises to 40% over the period, and then has dwindled since. If you look at the case of Scotland, you see a different picture where you see support for independence increasingly rising over this period. And then from 2016 on, so from Brexit on, you start to see support for independence increase a bit more. So you have quite kind of this idea of independence that we so associate with these two groups moving from the margins to the mainstreams. But the biggest contrast and comparison here is this process of having the referendum. And as you can see here in the pictures, in the bottom, you have this democratic vote taking place in Scotland in 2014. You have the yes camp and the no camp campaigning outside polling booths, trying to convince people to vote yes or to vote no. You don't have this in the case of Spain, where you have an illegal referendum, and then you have quite a harsh, draconian reaction from the Spanish state in order to stop this. I'm aware that I'm running out of time, so I will just kind of shoot forward towards conclusion. I'm quite happy to share these slides with you, but kind of where I go from this in the book is to, as you've seen in the conclusion that I shared with you, is to then say, okay, we've learned some of these lessons, so how do we think about constitutional design, and how do we refashion the territorial models in both of these cases? And as you can see here, there's I've put in a newspaper article where my proposal to abolish parliamentary sovereignty UK was picked up by some of the newspapers in Scotland to say that, an academic has called for this, and what would this mean, and is this something that can happen, or is this something that's too controversial? And then just to finish here is to think about where are we now? So Yonatan, if you just allow me 1 minute to sort of finish here. A lot has changed since 2020. We've had resignations, for example, in the case of Scotland, where the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, resigned. Her successor was in place for a short period and then resigned, and we have another First Minister. And the case in Spain, we've also had a change of governments within both the Catalan system. So we have quite a lot of change. So I'm quite happy with the title of Nations in Flux, because I think this title will stand the test of time, because even throughout this 10-year period, we see this influx within both cases. But from 2020 onwards, we've seen this change as well. So in the case of Spain, you have the socialists are still in government, but in order to get back into government in 2023, they had to rely on the votes of Catalan nationalist parties. And in order to do that, they had to give concessions, which included pardoning those arrested for the referendum in 2017. We just had a few months ago an election in Catalonia, and for the first time in over a decade, Catalonia now has a government that is committed to Spain rather than to the idea of independence. And so here we see this salience of the independence issue completely dwindle a bit within Catalonia. And yet we have the opposite in Scotland, where the salience of independence is no longer at the top of the political agenda, but support for independence in Scotland has not dropped below 2014. So that is, we will in a few months' time celebrate the 10-year anniversary of this referendum, and support for independence 10 years later is still as solid as it was 10 years ago. So that is an important challenge for the new Labour government that have been elected in the case of the UK. They have come into power willing to reset relations. You had, as you can see in the picture here, the Prime Minister Keir Starmer went immediately to Scotland, to Wales and to Northern Ireland to meet the devolved leaders. What will be interesting here is we have elections in Scotland in 2026. Will the pro-independence Nationalist Party be able to hold on to power? They've been in power for 17 years. Or are we going to see a similar situation that's happened in Catalonia, where the Socialists, in this case the Labour Party, will they be able to win back the crown as the Scottish government? So nothing is certain except one thing, that both Catalonia and Scotland, for the foreseeable future, will continue to be nations in flux. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was, I think, very interesting and very insightful presentation to the developments both in Scotland and in Catalonia. I'm just going to give the chance for our participants to put their questions and comments. So please feel free to raise your hands if you have any questions or comments. We have about 20 minutes. You can also put your questions and comments in the chat box. In the meantime, while I wait for that, I'm going to use my privilege of hosting the session and to ask you one or two questions to start off. So one of the things I think, which is also reflected in your title, Nations in Flux, I think reveals something about the fact that the processes of accommodation of sort of diversity is always dynamic. It's not linear in terms of the progress, but there have also been sort of reversals of gains, backlashes from, for example, in terms of majority nationalism. So maybe if you can say a few words on that, sort of this dynamic nature of accommodation of diversity, and what that says about how we should respond to challenges. And the second question is, there is often this argument that's often made that there is sort of a correlation between the sort of the recognition or the absence of recognition that a state provides to in terms of to diversity will also affect the institutional arrangement that will be made available, and that if a country is more open to recognition, then it's more likely to have a more accommodating institutional arrangement in terms of self-rule and shared rule. But is that always the case? Because I think you mentioned in Scotland, for example, that there is recognition of Scotland, at least symbolic recognition, in terms of constitution, but that doesn't necessarily translate into Scotland becoming sort of an equal partner, as you say in the book, of the Union. So perhaps maybe you can comment on those two questions, and then in the meantime I collect others. Thank you. So
two very big and very difficult questions, of course. So picking up in the first one about this dynamic nature, this is something that I think is hugely important. And I think it's something that federal scholars have been slow until the last few years, perhaps decades, to catch up with in this kind of process that even processes of federalism, you don't just have a federal moment, create a federal system, and that's it. That we have things that change throughout time. And I often give the example to students of the topic of climate change. That if you go back and look at even the Federalist Papers and the discussion of dividing power and autonomy, no one was talking about climate change then, and also no government on its own can manage climate change. So we have to acknowledge that the context change and this dynamic process is key. But you are right that we have in Spain, but also in the UK, processes of backlash towards recognition and asymmetry. So the process, the idea of asymmetry in Spain in the democratic transition in the 1970s was considered crucial in order to get the Catalans and the Basques on board. Fast forward, 20, 30, 40 years later, I have a quote in the book, I think, from a politician from the centre right, who says, well, every autonomous community now is the same. So that asymmetry that we had at the beginning can no longer be the same because we think this privileges one community above the other. And I wholly disagree with that, because what we find is that it privileges the majority above the minority. But also in the case of the UK, the Brexit process, we had a referendum across the UK, and Scotland as a nation voted against Brexit. But Scotland has left the European Union because England is much bigger, and it voted for Brexit. And here we saw this idea of the UK as a plurinational state and a plurinational union become really challenged. And we saw a bit of a backlash when the majority was thinking it wasn't going to get its way. Then you start to see this backlash here. So I think a static interpretation or understanding of the state is dangerous. That actually we need to be able to have dynamic processes of territorial. And this should be a constant dialogue between the different parts of the state. And if you have this kind of federal political culture that I've mentioned, where different parts of the territory are willing to come together, work together, compromise, discuss these things, then that should not be easy, but it should be less difficult than just the majority getting its way. And in terms of the correlation, I think it's an interesting dynamic. There is no, as you're well aware, Yonatan, there's no correct answer to this. We can look at the case of Canada as well, where French is an official language and was made an official language in the 1980s, and yet we still had a very active secessionist movement. The case, and I think what's interesting in the case of the UK, is recognition. Independence is not about recognition. So in Catalonia, it does form a part of it. But in the UK, rationales for Scottish independence are very much linked with economic issues, but more political issues, that Scotland, or the people in Scotland, or some people in Scotland, see themselves differently, that the government should have different priorities, that Scotland's voice is not heard, and things like this. So I think you have stronger political rationales for independence. And that's why in the book, I don't just want to focus on the institutions. I also wanted to focus on those actors, because the institutions can be perfect, but if the actors within the institutions don't want them to work, they won't work. And so I think there's no right answer to what you're saying, but it's certainly relevant to look at all those different aspects.
Thank you very much. I see Professor Leroux.
Thank you, Yonatan. I think there's some questions in the comments. Maybe deal with those ones first, because I want to ask something about South Africa, and I think those questions are more pertinent to the topic. If there's time left, we can come back to me. Okay. Otherwise, it's fine. Right. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. So there are a couple of questions in the chat. If you can, I don't know if you see them there. So, and Tabiseng asks, to what extent has the European Union's attitude on regional independence influenced the constitutional debates in both Catalonia and Scotland, and what were the implications? And Rashida asks, why do you think secession was not considered as an option for Scotland or Catalonia, despite being powerful sub-state entities? And then Gosai asks, have you considered Northern Ireland, and how does that compare with Scotland issues? Isn't Northern Ireland more pertinent to compare with Catalonia, as both experience of violent nationalism?
Good.
And
okay.
There's a couple of other questions, but let me maybe give you that.
Okay, give me those three, and then. So yeah, fantastic question. So the first question on the European Union is a really interesting question, and I have a paper that we've just submitted at the moment that's looking at how the European Union has the attitude of the European Union changed pre and post Brexit, and so there's something interesting there. So the first thing to say is that European Union maintains neutrality on these issues, that they see independence as an internal matter for a member state. That's what they say. What they do is can be considered a bit different. So, for example, in the 2014 independence referendum, the European Union maintained this neutrality, but then some important figures would give interviews to say, well, we're neutral in this issue, but it would be very difficult for an independent Scotland to join the European Union. That's not neutral. Okay, it's negative neutrality, I think we call it in the paper. But in the case of Scotland, there was a legal process agreed between the different governments, and so therefore the European Union sort of stepped back. What we're arguing in this paper is what we see from post-Brexit is a changing attitude within the European Union. So acknowledgement that Scotland could join the European Union, that it wouldn't be at the end of the queue, as was hinted at before. We see ministers and member state governments talking about empathy towards Scotland because they know that Scotland voted to remain within the European Union but now has left. But what we don't see is any change in policy. So the policy remains that if Scotland wants to join the European Union, then it has to do so through a formal process. So there's, I think we called it, there's words but not deeds. So there's a lot of positive rhetoric, but not so much in policy. That's quite different when it comes to Catalonia, because as far as the European Union was concerned, there was no overt criticism of Catalonia's process of secessionism or this idea of secessionism. The European Union doesn't necessarily oppose independence as a project. And in fact, you could argue, and I have a paper that does argue this, that the European Union encourages independence because it provides a safety net for small nations. But in the case of Catalonia, they were much more critical because the independence referendum went against the Spanish constitution. And the European Union is a club of member states. So they backed the Spanish government in saying, they have to stop this referendum from going ahead because it's illegal, or we support what the Spanish government is doing. So you have quite a contrast in both of those. The sort of second question, I think, is really what it's asking is why did people vote no in Scotland in 2014? And again, it comes back to context. I think here, why people, the kind of, I've got another project at the moment where we're looking at rationales for and against independence. And most people's rationales in 2014 against independence, and still to this day, relate to economic issues, in that they're unsure if Scotland would be able to flourish as an independent country economically. Survive, most people would agree, including unionists, that Scotland could survive as an independent state economically. Whether or not it would be a successful economic state is what's up for debate. So you had this was the winning argument in 2014, and if there was to be another independence referendum, it would continue to be the main argument. So I think those economic reasons continue to be important to convince people against voting for independence. And we saw this during the COVID pandemic, where the UK government consistently talked about the economic might of the UK Treasury, the broad shoulders of the United Kingdom, that without this economic might of a big country, we would not have had, for example, the first vaccine. And they talked about, there's a quote, something about a British vaccine in Scottish arms, that the British created this vaccine. So this kind of bolstering the union is something that continues to be a feature today, and we have this cost of living crisis over the last couple of years, and that continues to go on, these economic arguments around independence and union. And then the final question on Northern Ireland is a really great question. I've just published a book chapter on Northern Ireland, comparing Northern Ireland and South Tyrol in terms of power sharing, and there are, of course, significant similarities between both cases, but around violence. But the issue of violence in Catalonia is that this was sporadic violence, that it was some kind of overzealous, enthusiastic police officers in 2017. Catalonia does not have a history of violent extremism in favor of independence like you have or like you had in Northern Ireland or had in the Basque Country. So probably here, the Basque Country and Northern Ireland are much better comparison, but there are of course similarities between all of these cases, and hopefully the book can shed light on all of this for different minority nations across the world.
All right, thank you. It's almost time, but there are a couple of questions. Would it be okay?
I have time if you want, because I know I spoke for too long, so you have
all
me
right,
as long.
I'm just going to take these two questions, last question. So Abdul Jabbar asks about the relevance of the constitutional arrangements to the situation in. Let me just get it again. Just post it. So Lippard's, he talked about the Lippard's constitutional model. It has focused on power sharing between ethnic and religious groups, as the case in Burundi. But how can the same be adopted for national minorities seeking territorial autonomy within a larger state? And Tuabo asks, what explains the 2024 development of Catalonia's change in terms of the unionist Catalonia's party's electoral victory? And finally, I think Ben talks about different gatekeeping. So he says, I think you mean that it's easier for various groups, potentially including migrants, to acquire a British identity in comparison to Spanish identity in Spain, and that this difference does influence the extent that minority groups tend to claim a different identity. If so, it means that a minority claims can be addressed through making a national identity easier to associate with, in place of greater recognition of minority groups. So those will be the last questions. Thank you.
Perfect. So to pick up on the consociational stuff, the main argument I'm driving in the book is not that Scotland or Catalonia or the UK or Spain should become consociational systems. We do have consociationalism in the UK, in Northern Ireland as a consociational system, but I'm not arguing that this is what we need in the UK. I think what we can learn from consociationalism is about tempering the majoritarianism within the system. So drawing upon consociationalism for me in the book is not to say that this is relevant for minority groups, but the same accommodative behavior that we associate with accommodating ethnic or linguistic or religious groups can be and should be applied to national minorities. There is a quote, and I'll share the slides with Yonatan that you can share with you, that I have in it from Alain Gagnon in Quebec, where he talks about the importance of majorities to if they want the states to stay together and have this promising future, then the majorities have to at times think like the minority. And I think this is where consociationalism, creating this partnership of equals, at least in theory, is something that I think is important for us, that we can learn lessons from this. And I think in the book, I call it a plurinational sensitive political culture, whereas just, often what happens in these debates in both Spain and UK is it doesn't matter about the territorial models, they're just forgotten about. So I have, in this new project I'm working on, a civil servant who told me I have a post-it note on my computer that says, remember Scotland, because it's just not, it's an alien concept when you are part of the majority system. So I think there's a lot we can learn from consociational philosophy rather than the institutional structures. The last question, I'll take the last question and then I'll come back to 2024 to finish. So here, there is this interesting debate, and if you read Will Kimlicka around national minorities and immigrants, my point is not that immigrants can easily adopt, or migrants, sorry, can easily adopt the identities. To a certain extent they can, and certainly in the case of UK, British identity was for a long time. We have some horrendous problems now, but seen as this welcome, inclusive, multicultural identity. But I think what you have in these cases is that you couldn't be British without identifying really with Scotland or Wales or Ireland or English. Whereas in the case of Spain, if you were identifying as a Catalan, it was seen as a challenge to your national identity, to the national identity of Spain. Whereas in the UK, that hasn't been the case. What is interesting now, however, in the UK is you have very few people identifying only or as exclusively British. So that has dwindled in recent years, partially because those elements I talked about earlier of empire, war, religion, those don't exist today like they did in the 18th, 19th centuries. So you have this conception of Britishness changing, and more people now tend to identify with the nation, but not denying their British identity. So you will have quite a significant people say, I'm exclusively Scottish, but the majority of people will say, well, I'm both, or I feel more Scottish, but I have a British passport, etc. But here what you have in the case of Britain is a more effort to create an inclusive identity. But in the case of Spain, in Spain, you've had, authoritarian dictatorships where, if you spoke Catalan, you were taken off and arrested or executed, etc., etc. You've never had that in the UK. And then the final question is an excellent question on what changed in 2024 and why have we got this new pro-union government in Catalonia. And it's basically because when the Spanish socialists came in 2018 to the government in Madrid, they worked hard to manage this Catalan issue as a political issue. So if you meant, before I said the Conservative government that was in power up until 2018 saw it as a legal issue. And as a legal issue, they didn't touch it. They didn't sit down to negotiate. They didn't work with the Catalan government or different political parties. Whereas when Pedro Sanchez, the current prime minister, came in 2018, he made it his objective to say, well, I'm against Catalan independence. And if you declare independence again, then I will suspend the autonomy of Catalonia. But rather than see this as a legal issue, we have to sort of sit down and resolve this. And so that's why you have processes of resolution. You have a process of pardonings, of amnesty laws, where the Spanish government have said, okay, this happened, but we have to compromise a bit here in order to move forward. And I think people within Catalonia who maybe were on the fence, or what we would call a soft yes, so not a diehard pro-independence person, but would maybe vote for independence because they didn't think the Spanish government was dealing with the issue. We've seen a change now where you have a Spanish government willing to discuss the issue and deal with it. How long that lasts is up for debate, but I think what you have is effort on the part of the socialist government in Spain to create a system where they can manage these demands politically rather than legally. And so far, that seems to have paid off.
Thank you very much for, I think, today's discussion and presentation, and the discussion has, I think, revealed the great value that your book adds to the debate around accommodation of national diversity in multi-ethnic, multi-linguistic, multi-religious context. And my students will be writing a reaction paper on your chapters. So the conversation will continue. And I think you've given us more reasons why we should now order your book to our library. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody for yes. Goodbye.
Thank you. And I'll email you the slides, Yonatan, you can share them with the students.
Sure.